everything that's said and done now will be streaming on YouTube. Al? Can you guys hear me? So it's probably going to be about 5 more minutes till the other classrooms sign on, and then we're going to go. But it's going to be live this whole time, and I'm going to need a water camera sanity right now. It'll be fun.
Scooch down here.
There we go.
Yeah, sure.
There was a poleaxe. Okay, I should not get in the water.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
This is new.
So today, so yesterday was their first day in the Caymans. And so all the scientists showed up yesterday, and they did their first dive yesterday. And so can I get everyone like on this side of the tables?
Can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
So we're on the Seakeeper. I'm going to say all this stuff again, but this is the boat that the Department of the Environment owns. And so we're here with reef researchers and Department of Environment researchers. And we just got to the site, and the conditions look pretty good.
Yeah, they do.
We just saw a turtle that just came up on the side of the boat a minute ago, so hopefully we'll see him when we go down. You guys turn your audio off. Thank you. All right, just hold tight for just a couple more minutes, and then we'll get started. Hello, Spot Bay on. Is that Spot Bay there? It's so good to see you guys, Spot Bay. All right.
I'm not going to say one.
Good morning. Good morning, Spot Bay. It's good to see you. We're out here. We're just about to get started. We're going to wait just 1 more minute and see if another classroom joins, and then we're going to get started, okay?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. John Gray just signed on. Hi, John Gray. I see John Gray High School. Welcome, you guys. So excited you're here. Give us just 1 more minute, and we're going to get started. Hello. Okay, we're going to go now.
We're waiting for a few more students to arrive as well. If you can hear.
If it works correctly, you test it. I'm from the Department of Environment, by the way. If it works correctly, you should be able to.
All right, so if John Gray could turn, I just want you to mute your microphone. I'll actually do it for you. There we go. Okay, so before we get started, just a couple of things to remember. Classrooms, keep your mute on for now. Teachers, if you want to see, there's a chat window on the top left-hand side of your screen. There's an icon that looks like a chat window. If you click on that, you'll get a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have something to ask or if you're having troubles, rather than interrupting the live feed, you can text, you can type in a message there and I'll see it and I can help you. Does that make sense? We're going to go underwater and then we'll have questions at the end. Are you all ready? Give me a thumbs up if you're ready. Yeah? Okay. All right, welcome everybody. This is our second live feed on Grouper Moon 2019. I'm so happy that you guys are here. It's a beautiful day on Little Cayman. And we're on a boat called the Seakeeper, which is run by the Department of the Environment here in Cayman Islands. And we just drove out to a dive site on Bloody Bay Wall called Mixing Bowl, which we think you guys are gonna really enjoy. Right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn over to our underwater camera and I'm gonna introduce you guys to the crew that's here and who's gonna be going underwater with you and taking you on your virtual dive. So hold on and we're gonna go over to the other camera. All right, so if you could point, so right now we're looking at Croy. Croy, can you wave at the camera? That's Croy, and Croy works for the Department of the Environment, and then next to him is Dr. Bryce Simmons. Wave, Dr. Bryce Simmons. And then right over here is Dr. Christy Pattengill Simmons. And then there is Lynn Waterhouse, who is actually going to be leading you on the underwater dive today. Isn't that awesome? Dr. Lynn Waterhouse, yes. And Croy, Dr. Croy McCoy. We've got a lot of doctors on board. And then we have Tom Spark right there, who is working with Reef. And then we have Hal Peterson, who is a man of many talents and helps to keep this program going. So it takes a crew to get this show on the road. So now we're gonna get Lynn geared up and you're gonna see her start to get into the water. You're gonna notice that Lynn's gonna put on a different kind of face mask. And it's a special kind of face mask called an AGA face mask, and it allows her to talk and still breathe while she's underwater. Usually when you're underwater, you have a regulator in your mouth that you're breathing on. But if you had a regulator in your mouth, you wouldn't be able to also talk. So we have a special face mask that you're gonna see her put on in a minute. Right now she's putting on her BC, her vest, which is attached to her tank of air. And then her octopus and her regulator that she's going to be breathing with. Okay, so you can see she's got a special face mask. That's the AGA face mask. And on her ear is an audio piece so that she can hear us when we talk to her. Lynn, can you try to say something?
Hi, everyone.
Can you hear Lynn? Say it again.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing today?
Yeah, you could hear her? Excellent. All right, great. So Lynn's just going to check a couple of things, make sure that her mask is on tight, not going to leak any water. All of her BC is set up correctly, and then we're going to get under the water.
Great.
Okay, Lynn, how you doing?
I think I'm all ready to go. Just gotta get my fins on.
All right, so we're going to watch Lynn, and she's going to walk over, and then Dr. Christy Pattengill Simmons is going to be our camera person today. So she's going to go down with Lynn, and we'll be shooting film of Lynn as she's taking you on this dive. Now the dive is what the reef looks like. The reef here on Bloody Bay on Little Cayman is one of the most healthy in the Caribbean, and we're going to show you some of the indicators of a healthy reef. But I'd also like if you guys paid attention to see, you know, what do you think, what do you notice about the reef down there, and be thinking of questions that you'd like to ask at the end, okay? All right, here we go. And you can see we've already got a couple of divers in the water. We actually have to have several divers in the water for us to, you can see, because in order for Lynn to be able to talk, can you hear that, Lynn? So in order for Lynn to be able to talk and hear, she has tethers, which are cords that go from her all the way to the boat. We have about 300 meters of it. And so we have to have several divers down there holding those lines to make sure that they don't land on any of the coral. And you can see now, Lynn's about to get in. There's Hal. And you can see they're holding those lines. And they'll be doing that the entire time. So you may see people in the background holding those lines. That's what they're doing. And you saw Christy just put her hand on her head like that. That tells everyone that she's doing okay, that she got in fine and everything's working. Oh, here we go. So like I said, we're at a dive site called Mixing Bowl, which goes down to about 60 feet. And you're going to see tons of coral, you're going to see tons of sponges, and hopefully a ton of fish. Just as we were getting set up on the dive, a turtle came up right next to the boat. So perhaps keep your eyes peeled, we will find a turtle down below. I'm going to come back to me for a second. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Bryce Simmons. Okay, I'm going to pass off to Dr. Bryce, and he's just going to introduce himself really quick while Lynn gets down under the water. Lynn, can you say something?
Yes. So we are just down below the DOE boat here at Mixing Bowl. And you can see we've got some sponges and some soft fans here. Were you able to hear that, Todd?
Yes, I can hear that.
Great.
Students, are you able to hear Lynn?
So we're going to work our way over to the edge of the wall. You also notice there's a variety of different algae. And Christy's showing some coral, some hard coral right now.
Lynn, I'm going to explain a little bit about the corals that they're seeing, okay?
Great, thank you.
All right, I'm going to pass the microphone to Dr. Bryce Simmons, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you guys are seeing down there. Here we go.
Hello, friends. This is Bryce Simmons, and I've got also with me here Dr. Croy McCoy from the Cayman Islands Department of Environment. Croy and I have been spending a lot of time over the last decade and a half looking at all the different species of corals and fishes that exist here in the Cayman Islands. Bloody Bay Wall happens to be one of the most famous of dive sites. It's famous not only for the fact that it's got an absolutely stunning, long, steep wall that drops down into the abyss, but it also happens to have some of the best and most healthy coral cover of anywhere in the Caribbean. So it's one of the really the bright spots of Caribbean reefs in terms of health. And of course, one of the things that people often see here in the Cayman Islands, especially on Bloody Bay Wall, is Nassau grouper. And if we get lucky today, we might see a Nassau grouper, although remember that the vast majority of the big Nassau grouper are in fact not on Bloody Bay. They're all the way out at the very western end of the island where they're there to reproduce. They're there for that spawning aggregation. So I'm going to hand the phone off to Croy, Dr. McCoy, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the corals here on Bloody Bay Wall.
Hello,
everyone.
Corals. Dr. McCoy is going to give a little talk about some of those corals. So if you can keep Christy kind of pointed towards the coral for a minute, that'd be great.
Great.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Turn that way, big voice.
Here we have two different types of boulder corals. The one with a big polyp steer to the right is the Montastra cavernosa that build big mounds that we see out on the coral reefs and provides a lot of habitat for a lot of critters, crabs and fish and stuff like that. They're filter feeders. They have polyps that extend out into the water to capture like little plankton, little animals that float by, and they mainly feed at night.
Croy, I noticed that some of the corals don't seem as hard as the other corals. Are there different types of corals down there?
Yeah, the reef comprised of soft and hard corals, and mainly they want more flexible ones.
Yes, keep looking at the coral. We're now talking about the soft corals.
The softer ones, they're like the sea fans. They tend to they also filter water, but they move back and forth with the currents in the water as they filter.
Why are they so important to the reef ecosystem?
They too themselves are very important to the reef in the sense of not only the beauty, but they all work together as an ecosystem for it to function and work properly. They also provide a lot of habitat for other smaller fish that actually hide amongst them. And they're faster growing than the larger, harder corals that we talked about just now. These guys grow like 10 times faster. The other hard corals grow a max of like 3 to 5 millimeters per year, sometimes even slower. So the reef you see are hundreds of years old when you look at coral heads. Whereas the softer corals are faster growing, but they also don't live as long as the hard corals.
All right, Lynn, let's move on to something else.
All right. I don't know if Bill mentioned this, but if you notice, one thing that you did not see a lot of on this reef at all is there's no line, and we haven't seen any garbage yet, which also contributes to making this a really healthy home for all this fish life.
Dr. Simmons, could you talk about some of these fish that we're seeing all in the water column here? That looks like there's quite a few.
Sure, I can. And Todd, while I'm doing that, maybe you should go ahead and tell Lynn that we're talking about the plankton pickers or the plankton feeders so that she can focus on the camera on some of those. So you guys might notice that
We're going to look at the
it kind of looks
now.
like
So if you guys can point to the
a
plankton
steep,
feeders in the water
when they
column.
point out towards the wall. See, there you can see it. Now that is, you're looking out over the wall, and the wall itself is very steep. So it's not that the camera is twisted. The wall itself is actually dropping off vertically. So they're actually sitting on the precipice of the ocean. And there, right at the very edge of the shelf, are all those fish in the water. Do you guys see those? Those are Creole wrasse, but there's all different kinds of species of fish that do what Creole wrasse that you're looking at right there are doing, and that is to feed.
We had a large lobster down here on the reef. There it is. Let's see if Christy sees it too.
What kind of lobster is down there, Lynn?
So this is the Caribbean lobster.
Caribbean spiny lobster?
Yes. And it makes its home here on the reef.
Now we see it.
Okay.
Have Christy point the camera down a bit there. That's better.
Okay.
All right, Bryce is going to explain a little bit about that lobster.
Go ahead and have her keep pointing the camera down. She's a little
Keep
over.
pointing the camera down. Christy's a little bit high with the camera.
So yeah, as Lynn was mentioning, that's a Caribbean spiny lobster. So we were talking about plankton pickers out of the shelf, and those guys come in and they feed off of all the zooplankton and the tiny animals that are washing in from the open ocean. But there at that shelf edge, there's lots of things that live on the benthos. Benthos, that's a fun word. It means on the ground of the reef, on the floor, the sea floor. And spiny lobster are a creature that does live on the benthos. They spend their entire lives. Oh, I need you guys to see that. That's Lynn is just pointing out there's a Nassau grouper that just swam right behind the lobster.
We saw that, yes.
And that is a blackjack. So the
Aggregation.
Say that again, Lynn.
Oh, and here's another one. And it's a lighter coloration. I think Christy's going to try to get it. So there's two juvenile Nassau grouper down here.
Is that a good sign, Lynn?
This is. It means that a couple years ago, we must have had a recruitment class where some of the larvae settled onto the reef here.
So that means that on that year, some of them survived and made it all the way back to the adults?
Yes.
Or juveniles?
Yes, it's a really good sign. And so, as this Nassau grouper continues to grow, eventually when it's somewhere between 4 and 7 years, it'll go to the aggregation to spawn.
Wonderful, thank you. Keep looking for stuff, and we'll keep talking up here.
Great.
So if you see some of those blue and kind of almost yellowish or orangish fish swimming by, those are close-ups of those creel wrasse or those plankton pickers. And there's a big school of them right there. They live right on the shelf edge. And there they will make their living by feeding off of the tiny animals that wash in. That big tube there, you guys probably saw that. That's actually a sponge. Sponges also filter the water. So they take water from the sides and they push all the water that they filtered up through the center of that tube. There's actually a little bit of current that comes up through that tube, almost like a smokestack. While you're watching the video, you're going to see all kinds of different structure on the bottom. And like Dr. McCoy was saying, the bottom is made up of all kinds of different animals and plants. But reality is that on a healthy coral reef, sometimes the majority of the bottom is made up of animals. So it turns out that those corals that we were talking about earlier, those are actually a series of tiny animals that build their home all together. They're called polyps. And those tiny animals build a coral structure or a house for themselves, and they live all next to each other. So they reproduce by cloning or by polyping off. And so you get many individuals.
The camera seems to be on Christy primarily right now.
Many individuals of the exact same genetic makeup that make up those coral colonies.
That's better. Yeah, you can tell us what you see if you want.
Yeah, so this is a really great giant barrel sponge. Sometimes these will turn into cleaning stations. But right now there's no one getting cleaned here. Although it is habitat for many creatures.
How big would you say that sponge is?
It looks to be about 2 to 3 foot diameter and probably 4 foot tall. And they can get much larger than that. It's quite big.
Wonderful. You can keep looking for other stuff, and we'll talk a little bit more about sponge while you do that.
All right.
So like we were talking about, a coral is an animal, and they build their own houses. And so there's lots of different animals that exist on the reef itself. Now she's pointing out a different kind of sponge there as well. So lots of different species of sponges and corals make up the bottom. And in fact, corals are often responsible for building entire edges of islands. So over many thousands of years, that's a tiger grouper, you guys. See that? Yeah, it's kind of striped like a tiger. That's That's what's called a piscivore. That's a fun word. That means they're fish eaters. They eat other smaller fish. That type of grouper also goes out to the same spawning aggregation as Nassau grouper. And now you're seeing another Nassau grouper underneath the shelf. There, see that Nassau grouper?
We see that.
Yeah, that's also another, as Lynn was talking about, that's a juvenile Nassau grouper as well. And that's probably why it's not out at the spawning site. So like Lynn was saying, they take maybe 5 to 7 years of growing before they're ready to go out to the spawning site and reproduce. And so this little guy right here, he's probably only about 3, maybe 4 years old. So he's probably not ready to reproduce yet. So he gets to have the reef all to himself while all the grown-ups are gone.
Bryce, Lynn mentioned something about a cleaning station that she was looking for on the sponge. What was she talking about?
Yeah, so fish like to use different parts of the reef like you might use a car wash. So there are tiny little fish and shrimp that are specially adapted in order to find and pick off all of the little parasites that exist on fish. And so a fish will go up and it will find a location where these small fish are, and small gobies, and it's typically in a sponge or on a particular coral head, and they will park themselves right next to those tiny fish, and then they'll open their mouths wide, and those fish and shrimp will actually go inside the mouth and clean and pick out all those parasites. They get like a little car wash, but it's free.
See that?
Yes, tell us what that is.
So that is a lionfish, which should not be here. They are native to the Indo-Pacific, and unfortunately they got released in Florida, most likely, and spread throughout the Caribbean.
How big would you say that lionfish is?
I think he might be 8 inches.
Looks pretty big.
Yeah, that is a large one. And they are voracious predators.
All right, keep looking, and Bryce is going to keep talking about a cleaning station.
Yeah, so like I was talking about, they use these little areas kind of like car washes, so they get a little tune-up, or they get cleaned up by the little fish that specialize on eating parasites off of bigger fish. Lynn was pointing out that lionfish. What's really, we talk about Nassau grouper as being part of a healthy ecosystem. And one of the ways that Nassau grouper, larger grouper in general, are part of a healthy ecosystem is they control other smaller predators. And those smaller predators often will eat juvenile fish or the new baby fish that show up on the reefs. So kind of counterintuitively, those big fish are actually really good for healthy reefs in terms of allowing baby fish to grow up. Lionfish are particularly good at eating baby fish, but you know what's really good at eating lionfish? It's Nassau grouper and certain species of sharks. And so that's why it's important to have these larger, big predators on Caribbean coral reefs, because it helps with coral reef health. So there you're seeing, again, camera is not turned. You're looking at the side of a wall. So all of these sponges and corals that you're looking at are growing on the side of a wall. And as I was saying before, they're not just growing on the side of the wall, they're actually contributing to the construction of the wall. So over time, they build these coral skeletons, these calcium skeletons, and over many thousands of years, growing on top of each other over long periods of time, they can actually build a huge rock structure. Here's Lynn talking again.
If it's okay, is how vertical it is where we are right now. This is really why Bloody Bay Wall has its name. It's just a sheer drop off to the bottom, and all of the relief is really quite vertical, so everything is making its home along this wall.
Yeah, that's amazing, Lynn.
So Dr. McCoy was just talking about the sister islands. Go ahead.
Now we're just, as Bryce was talking about how the corals build over time of thousands of years. I mean, the underlying base of all 3 of these islands is a coral reef. So they keep building further and further as they emerge out of the water. So we are coral islands per se. That's what we are. So what we're looking at here are just the animals that have done that.
A variety of different sponges.
What we're going along and showing here is some of the algae. That algae there is a coralline algae that sort of breaks down to give us that sort of pinkish color we see on our beaches when you walk the beaches in the islands. As we Go along further here, we see other sponges that hang off the wall. They all hang out into the current and sort of feed as water flows by. They're all little animals that live in this whole system that we call a coral reef. Along here, we're also showing some other sponges. Along here, sponges come in different types. We have the tube ones, as we saw earlier. Then we have the encrusted ones that sort of grow over like a boulder, rock, or coral. Now we're looking at a bunch of those plankton feeders that Dr. Bryce Simmons was talking about that actually sit in the current and nip little animals out of the water.
That's so amazing. Thank you, Dr. Croy. So I think we have time for maybe about 5 more minutes down there, Lynn, if you want to keep showing us what you're seeing down there, and then we'll come back up and talk about it. Plus, you're running out of line, so you need to head back towards the boat a bit.
We are.
So what Dr. Croy was saying, guys. Oh, again?
We've got, you see inside this?
Yeah, we see that.
Yeah, so this is one of the many types of invertebrate life that you'll find on the reef. That was a bristle star.
So what Dr. Croy was saying, you guys, was that these islands that we're on right now are actually made of coral. They're all coral islands. Bryce, do you want to talk about the fish we're looking at right here?
Sure. Oh yeah, that's pretty. You guys see that? Those are 2 4-eye butterfly fish.
Keep eyes on those for a second.
Yeah, those are butterfly fish are particularly good at eating coral polyps. So if we get close enough here, you'll see that they kind of have a little pointy snout, and that pointy snout is really good for almost like forceps-like picking of polyps. And so there's a lot of species of butterfly fish that are adapted to feed on all of the coral that grows on coral reefs. What's also interesting about butterfly fish, and you'll see there's 2 here. Butterfly fish tend to stay together in pairs while they're mating, and they can stay together in the same pair for years sometimes. And so it's not uncommon to find 2 different butterfly fish that stick together no matter what. And so these guys are clearly, they're a couple. They're hanging out and they're unwilling to separate from each other. Yeah, they'll often, if you guys saw there's a black spot on the side of it, that's what's called an ocellated spot or a false eye. And so one of their defenses is when a big predator or something that looks like it's going to eat it comes up to it, it turns sideways like it was doing to us and it flares its fins. And Lynn has found a cleaning station. Anyway, that false eye is designed to make the predator think it's actually a much bigger fish.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Christy's showing you a cleaning station right now. And I think that's a juvenile. Gosh, can Bryce confirm the ID on that? That is not a NASA grouper.
No, that's right. That is a yellowfin grouper. That's a young yellowfin grouper.
A yellowfin grouper.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that yellowfin grouper was at one of those car washes. He was hanging out getting cleaned by some gobies.
We still got to see it.
Yeah, that was great, Lynn. We got to see that. And you'll see some, as we're looking up in the water column a little bit, we'll see some larger fish there with very scissor-like or forked tails. Those are yellowtail snapper. Go home and Lynn's talking.
We're nearing the edge of the plateau, so you can see the relief is starting to change, and there's also some more of those boulder-type corals. A lot of the soft corals as well.
So you're in shallower water now?
We are. We're back up to around 40 feet.
It looks beautiful. What is that fish right in front of us with the yellow tail?
That is a yellowtail snapper.
What kind of fish is that?
It's a snapper. Yellowtail snapper.
And what role does a yellowtail snapper have on a coral reef?
Sorry, say that again?
What is this new fish we see in front of us with two fins, one on the top and bottom?
Oh, the durgeon.
And are those plankton eaters?
They are.
All right, I'm going to hand it back to Bryce, and he's going to talk a little bit about those.
Great.
Yeah, so like Lynn was saying, that they're black durgeon are plankton feeders. They will also do a little bit of feeding on the bottom as well. They like to eat algae to some extent. We have all kinds of different plankton feeders. We talked about Creole wrasse. It turns out yellowtail snapper are also plankton feeders as well. Plankton feeders tend to have mouths that are directly out in front of their faces. So they're very close to their eyes, so they're able to see these small pieces of animals and bits of food that are coming in off the reef, and they will go ahead and just grab those as they fly in from the ocean. So the crest of the wall where the water is spilling onto the reef is a very important place for fish to get food. That's a parrotfish. You guys see that? So you see that parrotfish that was actually feeding on the bottom. Parrotfish are really important because they feed on algae. And why that's important is because algae, like coral, compete for space on the bottom. So they need space in order to grow on the benthos or the bottom as well. But algae are much better at feeding, at taking over space more quickly than corals. Corals, on the other hand, are more defended against getting eaten. So as long as you have a parrotfish around eating the algae, the corals can compete for space and they can grow. If you don't have parrotfish, you'll get algal overgrowth, or all the algae will win for space and all the coral will eventually go away. Christy and Lynn were pointing out there a long-spined squirrelfish. You guys see that? It's a red color and it's got a very big eye. Any fish that has a very big eye like that, that's a good clue that it's probably spending a lot of time out when it's dark. And so those types of species, the squirrel fishes, they'll spend a lot of time underneath cover in nooks and crannies on the reef, and at night or at dusk they'll come out and they'll feed. And they tend to feed on things like crustaceans, like little shrimp and crabs. Yeah, we can do that.
All right, Lynn, why don't you start heading back up, and we're going to talk a bit more about what you saw. And then when you guys are up, we're going to have you come on and talk a little bit as well, okay?
Okay, Lynn and Christy are now just pointing out, you guys are probably seeing that. That's a damselfish. It's similar in some ways to the damselfish on Finding Nemo, right? So, but interestingly, we don't have the anemone fish here in the Cayman. There's only in the Pacific. Nowhere in the Caribbean is there an anemone fish like in Finding Nemo. But that is a type of damsel, and we do have damselfish here, and that was one of them. Damsel are also herbivores. They eat algae, and they're very important for controlling algae so that coral can grow. But unlike parrotfish, which roam around the reef, damselfish typically maintain very small little territories, and they don't move away from those areas.
All right, guys. So they're going to start heading back up, and while they do that, I'm going to come back up here, and we're going to do a Q&A, okay? So hold on while I switch cameras to be with us right here. All right. What did you guys think of that? Was that cool? Do you like it? So while they're coming back on board, we're going to have time to do some questions from you guys. I think we're going to start with Spot Bay, and then John Gray, and then Renaissance. So if Spot Bay has a question, you guys can go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask, and I'm gonna pass the mic back to Dr. Semmons and Dr. McCoy, and they're gonna answer some of your questions about what you saw.
We put it on just regular. They're gonna hear the motor. Okay. Hi, my friends. Go ahead if you had a go ahead with a question.
How long is the rope?
Could you say that again a little louder?
How long is the line?
How long is the line? Ah, that's a great question. The video line that we have, it's fed all the way to where the divers are and comes all the way up onto the deck, and it's plugged in directly to our computer. So we have to have that connection, otherwise we won't be able to feed that high definition video up to the boat. The line itself is about 100 meters. That's roughly 300 feet. And so they didn't go 300 feet down. They only probably went about 60 feet down, but they left away from the boat to the side. And so we ended up using almost all of that line till they got to the farthest point away from the boat. So it's about 300 feet or 100 meters. Yeah. Is there another question?
So we're going to go over to John Gray.
Okay, we're going to go to John Gray. You're going to take the next one.
John Gray, you'll need to unmute your microphone.
Okay.
There we go. You can tell them they can ask the question now.
Go ahead.
Okay, good morning.
How do you identify all those fish in the ocean?
How were you able to identify all the different types of fish?
Could you repeat? I can barely hear you. Sorry.
How were you able to identify the different?
Big voice, John Gray.
Sorry?
Could you repeat that question? There's a delay.
How are you able to identify all the different types of fish?
You start, then you just fade off. I never heard the last one.
Okay, what was that question again?
How are you able to identify the different types of fish?
Was the question, how do we identify the different types of fish?
Yes, how are you able to?
Great question. How do we identify the different types of fish?
We noted various types of fish based on not only their morphology, but we have
What's morphology?
the shape of the fish, and also we have keys that we follow that sort of lays out and describes the animal, so that you, in the end, you can have, it doesn't matter what type of fish it is. In the end, it takes you to the proper fish based on its morphology. And diets we know from analysis of the stomachs of these animals. Do you have another question?
What happened if all the outfit groupers were killed?
All right, John Gray, what was that question again?
What would happen if all the juvenile fish were killed, the juvenile groupers?
That's a question. What do you guys think would happen if all the juvenile fish were killed? Does anyone there have a guess?
They'll become extinct.
Say that again.
They'll become extinct.
Absolutely. Yeah, if we don't have any juvenile fish, once the older fish die off, there will be no new fish, right? But conversely, if we take all the adult fish out, we won't have any fish that are old enough to reproduce. So both of those are bad scenarios, which is why we want to have a balance, a healthy balance of older and younger fish on the reef. We're gonna now head over to Renaissance, who I believe has a question. All right, Renaissance, you just need to unmute you. Okay, no. Only one at a time, guys. That's too loud.
How big is the reef?
Great question. Right? How big is the reef?
The question is, how big is the reef? That's a great question, and the answer is it depends on what you think of as a reef. Like Dr. McCoy was saying, the islands themselves are literally produced by the reef. So where you guys are sitting right now is an old reef that you're sitting on top of. It's of course no longer alive. It's the skeleton of an old reef, but nonetheless, it's the size of an island. Ultimately, is how big a reef is. Now, in terms of the growing reef itself, again, it depends on where you are. Here in the Cayman Islands, there is a ring of reef all the way around each of the 3 islands. And in places like the Great Barrier Reef and the Florida Keys Reef Tract, it can be hundreds or even thousands of miles long. And so it's often referred to as one of the largest sort of contiguous ecosystems in the marine environment. And what's really amazing is the reefs build habitat for themselves. And so you can really almost think of it as a superorganism. Yeah, that's a great question. So we're gonna head back over to Spot Bay. Okay, we're gonna head back over to Spot Bay now for another question. Okay, go ahead, Spot Bay.
How many types of groupers are there in the Caribbean?
How many types of groupers are there in the Caribbean? Gosh, that's a great question. Of the species that we typically see while we're diving, there's probably about 6 to 7 grouper, but there's also several different types of grouper that we almost never see while diving. Some of the biggest grouper are Goliath grouper or Warsaw grouper, both of which are found in the Cayman Islands, although as a diver you'd never see a Warsaw grouper. Just last month when we were down here for Grouper Moon, we saw a Goliath grouper, and those Goliath groupers, they can get to be 600-700 pounds and 7 feet long, so they're really, really big, some of the big ones. A Warsaw grouper also get very large, and of course Nassau grouper, they get pretty big as well. The largest Nassau grouper might be close to 50-60 pounds, so they can get quite large as well. Yeah, that's a great question.
All right, Spot Bay, do you have one more question? We can take one more from you.
How do you know if it's soft coral or a hard coral?
I'm sorry, that cut out. Can you ask one more time?
How do you know if it's a soft coral or a hard coral?
Okay, great question. The question was, how can you tell if it's a soft coral or if it's a hard coral? You can tell pretty easily when you're diving. The soft corals are actually will move in the water with the current, and the hard corals are fixed and just are literally hard and don't move at all. So a lot of those fans that you saw, those were soft corals. I'm going to try to unplug from this so we can just use the regular microphone. We'll see if that works. All right, can you guys hear me still?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to bring our 2 scientists that were underwater with you over here. And Spot Bay, if you have a question for them, you can be up next, and then we're going to pop back over to John Gray. So, Dr. Lynn. So if you guys want to give Dr. Lynn a round of applause, she was down there leading you through that underwater dive. Didn't she do an awesome job? Yeah. Dr. Pat Gill-Simmons there. Okay, so Spot Bay, if you have a question for Lynn or Christy, you can go ahead and ask.
Why is the fish called a four-eyed butterfish?
Say that one more time.
Why is the fish called a four-eyed butterfish?
Oh, the four-eyed butterfly fish is called that. The four-eyed butterfly fish is called that because it has the 2 real eyes, right? But did you see those big spots on the back of each side? They look like a big black spot with a white around it. Those are what are called false eyes. Sometimes butterflies have them on the backs of their wings. It's meant to confuse a predator. And so they've got the 2 real eyes and the 2 false eyes, which makes it a 4-eyed butterfly fish. And you almost always find them in pairs, like we saw that one.
That's a great question. We're going to head now over to John Gray. So I'm going to mute Spot Bay, and then John Gray, if you have a question, we're ready for you. Let's unmute you. There we go. All right, go ahead. Go for it.
The next question was, what happens if the corals on the reef die?
That's a really great question. So a lot of the coral death that's been happening elsewhere in the world has been from warming. And so for those corals, it really depends on how bad and how long the warming lasts for, if the corals are going to recover or not. If
the warming, you're talking about the warming water.
Warming water, yes. So if the water warms enough and the zooxanthellae leave the coral can't produce enough food, and so it's going to die. And it depends on how long that lasts for, if it's able to recover, or in some cases, if it goes on for too long, they totally die. And then what's going to happen is algae is going to overgrow it.
Right. So what Lynn was talking about was that coral is actually 2 animals living together. It's a zooxanthellae, which is an algae, and then there's a coral polyp, which is and they live together, and together they create that beautiful color and that structure that you see down there. But if it gets too warm, the zooxanthellae will leave. It'll float away. And if it does that, the coral polyp will slowly die. It'll start to bleach. And that's all because there's a very important balance that we have on coral reefs with water temperature and the amount of light that it gets. And we want to keep that pretty steady. If we throw that out of balance, then you have that, you know, the warming is one example of that. And that can have a really big impact on the coral. Does anyone at John Gray have another question? Yeah, go for it. We cannot hear that.
Why is the grouper population so highly protected?
Okay, the question was, why is the grouper population so highly protected? I'm going to pass that on to Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, so the Cayman Islands has a great set of protections for the Nassau grouper here in the country. And one of the reasons they're so highly protected, right, is because when they reproduce, they form those aggregations where they spawn. And those happen during known times and known places. So it's in the winter full moons, and it's in the same place each year. So if fishermen historically were able to figure out where those aggregations are, they can target them because it's really easy fishing. Normally, Nassau grouper live solitary lives. They each have their own home scattered throughout the reef, so it's really hard to catch a lot in one day. And they're pretty smart fish as well. So if you try to catch them, they'll dodge under a rock, which will make your fishing line break. But when it's time to spawn, they're all in one place, so it's really easy to harvest them. And so in a lot of places, their numbers have really gone down. So the Cayman Islands put in some really great comprehensive protection measures.
So, Dr. Lynn, what happens when you take we've used the term apex predator when talking about the grouper. When you take that out of an ecosystem, what does that do to the fish beneath it in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so it means that the balance of everything, all the trophic levels below.
Trophic levels?
Yes, trophic level. So if you think of a food web, you have different levels in the food web. So we can start at the bottom with like the algae or the plankton, and then we have planktivores. And then grouper, they eat other fish. So they're kind of a higher level predator. And when you remove them, the fish that they would normally eat, they're not getting eaten anymore. So it can throw things out of balance.
So it's that very careful balance that we talked about. And the fish that are at the top of that food web have a really important top-down effect on the rest of the fish. We're going to now head back over to Spot Bay. Thank you, John Gray. All right, Spot Bay, let's unmute you. All right, go for it, Spot Bay.
At what age do you call a Nassau grouper an adult?
The question was, at what age do you call a Nassau grouper an adult?
That's a good one. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, and the ones that we saw down there today are a couple of years old, probably 3 or 4 years old. We would call them probably an adult when they get to be 5 or 6 years old. So between 5 and 8 years old is when they're really an adult, and they'll start leaving and going to that spawning aggregation each winter. And then they can live to be in their 20s or maybe even in their early 30s. Some of the really old Nassau grouper can be at least 20 years old.
Great question. Spot Bay, do you have another question? Let's go ahead and unmute you. There we go.
Alana, ask a question. Ask a question. Okay, the right question.
Both your
We couldn't hear you.
Do you have black or pink coral here?
Is the question, do we have black coral here?
Yes.
Good question.
I don't think we have black coral in the Caribbean.
Hey, Dr. Croy, we're going to get our coral doctor here to answer that question. It's a great question, Spot Bay. They asked, is there black coral here?
Yeah,
Come closer, come closer.
there's quite a lot of black coral, but they're mainly found at the deeper depths. Along Bloody Bay is probably one of the shallower sites you find black coral. Some areas here you can find it as shallow as about 40 to 45 feet or so. Normally you find it 80 feet and below. But because the wall here lies in northeast southwest direction, and the sun rises and comes over, it's quite dark up shallow. So
It really needs that light.
what's that? It actually goes away from light.
Wow, it does.
That's why it's found at depths.
Wow. So that's different than the other corals.
Yeah, a total different, almost opposite. But as we mentioned, Bryce was talking about groupers. You have some groupers that live in depths 600 feet that we never really see, except for when they're very young juveniles that are on the reef, but as they get to the adults, they go in deeper. Black corals are predominantly found in the depths of 80 to 100 down to about 200 feet. But in this wall particularly, is found quite shallow, actually.
Great. All right. Wonderful question, Spot Bay. We're going to head back to Renaissance. Hi there, Renaissance. We're going to unmute you. Oh, we're still not unmuted. There we go. All right, Renaissance.
Okay, Bill, so there's a question that we've typed, Todd.
Oh, okay, hold on. Yes, the question is, well, the first question was how big the reef is, and that one was answered before. Did you get an alright answer for that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. And then the other one was, how many Nassau grouper have you seen so far on the aggregation? And I'm actually going to have one of the scientists who was there diving on it yesterday answer that question.
Right.
Dr. Bryce?
So yeah, we just went out yesterday for the first time during this this window of grouper moon, and we saw maybe 1,500, 1,500 fish out there, but we didn't see all of them. They were pretty spread out. Usually at the start of the spawning season, they'll be quite spread out across a very large area, and so as a diver, it's very difficult to go and do a complete census, or in other words, go and count all the fish that are there. But the ones that we did see, they were up in because there was so little current yesterday, it was really quite beautiful. They were up in small balls together, all balled up together, kind of milling around and checking each other out up off of the ground. In years past, when it's got later in the spawning season and all the fish are very densely concentrated, we've seen as many as 7,000 fish. And when you get that many fish, it's very difficult for a diver to count it. And so we don't just use counts by divers. We actually do what's called mark recapture, where we use small visual tags and we tag a very small proportion of the population, but then we go down and we do counts of tagged to untagged individuals of fish to come up with an estimate of the proportion of the population that's tagged. And from there, we can calculate how many total fish there are in the population. And from those estimates in the last year, we're up to about 7,000 fish. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not we get more fish this year, or if that number changes, but we haven't figured that out yet. So that's what's going to come next this week.
Cool. Okay, go ahead.
Excellent question. You got one more?
Yeah. How many manta rays have you seen out here?
Oh, great question. I have not seen any manta rays on this trip. I've seen quite a few stingrays. Has anyone seen any mantas on this trip? Do we see them here very often? Not too many here, but we do see spotted eagle rays, and I would suggest you look one of those up. In fact, I'll post some video of a spotted eagle ray, which is one of my favorite species to see when we're here on the reef. All right, we're going to head over to John Gray for one last question from them. All right, John Gray.
Okay. The last question here is, are the fish and cleaner fish, are they in a symbiotic relationship?
Great question. The question was, are the cleaner fish in a symbiotic relationship? And yes, they are. And what's really interesting is that some of those fish, when they're not on a cleaning station, they would regularly, eat each other or not be friends. But when they're on that spot, it's like they have a deal that they've made together, that when we're here, I'm not going to eat you, you're not going to eat me, you're going to be able to clean me, which gives them food. And then the fish that's getting cleaned gets healthy. So both of them are benefiting from that. We would call that a symbiotic relationship. That's a great question, John Gray. Do you have one more before we go?
Yeah. Do we have black or red groupers here?
Great question. Do we have black or red groupers here? Can you answer that question, Chris?
Sure. We here in the Cayman Islands, we don't have red grouper. Red grouper are only a coastal Caribbean species, so you'll find them along the coast of Mexico and in Florida, but not here in the Central Caribbean. We do have black grouper here, and some of the black grouper can get very large. You can get upwards of 100 pounds or more. Yeah,
wow.
So some of the black groupers can get very, very large here, and they also spawn just like the Nassau grouper and just like the tiger grouper that we talked about, and also just like the yellowfin grouper, they also spawn out at that same aggregation site. So one of the questions before is, why is it important to protect the grouper? We're not just protecting, well, the Cayman Islands is not just protecting grouper so that it can't get caught. The idea is to protect the aggregation site while those different species are reproducing, so you can let them make new baby grouper. But the Cayman Islands also has bag limits the rest of the year, which means that throughout the rest of the year, when it's not spawning season, you can in fact still catch Nassau grouper. So the point of it is to maintain a healthy population so that there is grouper to catch the rest of the year when they're not reproducing.
Great question, John Gray. We're going to head over to Spot Bay for their last question, and then we'll do one last question from Renaissance, and then we're going to have to say goodbye for today. All right, let's get John Gray on. I mean, Spot Bay, I'm sorry. We need you to unmute your microphone, Spot Bay. There you go.
How big is a NASA grouper's mouth?
Okay, the question was, how big is a Nassau mouth? I'm assuming that depends on the size of the Nassau grouper. But Dr. Simmons, how big would you say an adult Nassau grouper's mouth is?
I would say that if you took an adult grown man's hand and that large grouper opened its mouth all the way, you'd be easily able to fit your hand all the way into its mouth and touch its stomach. So It's very big. They're what's called a gape and suck predator. Well, that's kind of a fun word. What it means is their method of feeding is they get close to whatever it is that they're going to eat, and then they open up their mouth very quickly and very big. So they do like that, and that because the mouth is so big and that movement is so fast, it creates suction. And so anything that's in front of its mouth, when it opens up its mouth, gets sucked in to its mouth and ultimately its stomach. So that's the fact that its mouth is really big is actually part of the way it feeds. It uses that big mouth and rapid opening to suck food in. That's how it eats.
Wow, that is super cool. Great question, Spot Bay. Let's head back to Renaissance for our last question, and then we're going to say goodbye for today.
No.
All right, Renaissance.
Right there.
Is there more hard coral or soft coral?
Okay, great. So the question is there more hard coral or soft coral? Dr. Croy, could you come up and answer that question for us?
When it comes to coral, the different species are found in different depths. You mainly find the softer corals in the shallower depths, whereas you find the hard corals more in the deeper depths. When it comes to coverage, because coral themselves has a umbrella that you see as a boulder that you can measure the area, but soft corals, they're like, think of it as a sort of like a garden hose or whip. They're cylindrical and long, so it's hard to measure them. So when you do measure them, you count them as individuals, each little animal as one. Having said that, there is a big mix, but we have a tendency to have more hard corals than soft corals.
Okay. Hey, you guys, that was such a great question. All of your questions were wonderful. We are going to have to get off here in just a second. I know we didn't get to answer all of your questions, but you guys can email me your questions or you can ask them on the blog and I will respond to all of them. I want to thank you guys all for taking time out of your day and joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's live feed. It was really awesome. Why don't you guys unmute your mics and let's give the scientists a round of applause, okay? Okay. From Winter Moon 2019 on Little Cayman, we're signing off for today, and we'll see you guys all tomorrow on the live feed at 10:30. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.